Okay, so it's 6 p.m., and I guess that means we'll go ahead and get started. I thank everyone for joining us. I am John Collins. I'm the manager of programs and services with the Parkinson Society and do a number of things, including some of our education. So part of that involves setting up this webinar tonight. Again, I thank you for joining us. Sandy will be speaking to us, and Sandy Jones is a registered nurse, and she's the coordinator of client and education services. Her depth of knowledge on Parkinson's is broad, and she'll be sharing some of that with you tonight as part of the presentation. And additionally, we are hoping to have you interact with us as well. I asked for advanced questions. I received precisely 0, but we are hoping that the questions will help drive some of this session as well. So you'll see a chat box over on the right-hand side. Should just be off to the edge of this arrow here on your screen. If you enter some text into that chat, we'll be able to see it, and we can respond to your questions either as they come up this evening or at the end of the session, or anything that needs more information we can get back to you after the fact. So again, I thank you all for joining us. We're going to look at doing these webinars every so often, and we appreciate your interest in this one. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sandy.
Good evening, everybody. I think before we start into some of the symptoms, etc., that we will be going through when it comes to Parkinson's, it's important to talk about where we've been and where we are now. So if John could, there we go. So the bottom line is that the shaking palsy that was identified by Dr. James Parkinson's back in 1817 focused on the symptoms of Parkinson's and were described later on as a movement disorder. So between 1817 and 1960, which is a lot of years in between, their main focus of the researchers and clinicians was on treating the symptoms under an acronym of TRAP, which we're going to go through very shortly. From 1960 to 1970, there was two things that were very important happen. One was the discovery of the cause of TRAP, so the cause of those motor symptoms, and also the production of levodopa to alleviate many of these symptoms. Between 1970 and 2002, present day, levodopa remains the gold standard of Parkinson's treatment and really dramatically improves motor symptoms, in particular the slowness and stiffness. And then, between approximately 2008 and 2012, there has been an increasing awareness, diagnosis, and treatment of the non-motor symptoms. Now, before we go into a quick review of the motor symptoms, I just want to talk about what a movement disorder means. I regret that some of this information will be boring and ho-hum. I've heard it all before, but because I can't see you, the members of the audience tonight, I really don't have a way of knowing how much you know, how much you don't know, etc. And I can't use your facial expressions in order to be able to tell whether this is just becoming very redundant. So I do apologize for that in advance, but just bear with me and hopefully everybody will take something away from this tonight. The symptoms of any brain disease are partly determined by the location of the brain cells that degenerate and die off. Because neurodegenerative conditions, there are many of them. And so we often get the question, but, how come you know that I have Parkinson's? Well, we don't know that for sure, but basically we can look at what's going on. The doctors, certainly the clinicians, can examine you and see where your symptoms best fit when it comes to what cells are dying off and where those cells are located in the brain. So, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, it involves the degeneration of neurons or nerve cells of a part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. I don't expect you to remember that. I won't ask questions later. But just so that you know, the cerebral cortex is the area that's responsible for memory. So therefore, people with Alzheimer's disease have severe problems with their memory. In ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, the death of these motor neurons, neurons that are also responsible for movement, occur both in the spinal cord as well as in the brain, and they cause profound motor weakness. In Parkinson's disease, the brain cells that die off are located in an area of the brain that is important for control and regulation of spontaneous movement or motor activity. Therefore, we get movement disorder. So let's go over a quick review of the motor symptoms, basically under the acronym of the word TRAP. We use TRAP because many people tell us that they feel that their symptoms are keeping them trapped inside their own body. They know what they want to do, when they want to do it, and how they want to do it, but their body prevents them from doing that. Often, I've also heard people say that they feel like they're in a cage. They feel trapped, and it's often just medication that will allow them to get out of that cage. But that's where the word trap comes from. So the T in trap stands for tremor, basically a rhythmic back and forth motion of a body part, and most commonly seen in the thumb and forefinger, although that's more at the beginning and certainly can progress later on to other parts of the hand, arm, etc. The symptoms are more pronounced at rest, worsens with stress and or fatigue. They usually disappear during sleep, or they improve with voluntary movement. So for example, if you're holding your hand in your lap and your hand is tremoring, chances are if you move your hand to go to grab a cup of coffee or any object, a pen or anything of that nature, the tremor will stop. And that's where we get resting tremor comes from. Starts on one side of the body in the early stages, but often progresses to both sides later on in the condition, and commonly affects one side more than the other. So wherever the Parkinson's symptoms started will always be your worst side, for example. And tremor is a tough one to treat. Doctors often say that while it's one of the symptoms that is most bothersome for people with Parkinson's, because it's one that everybody can see, so it's more obvious, it also is one of the most elusive ones to treat. A lot of people do get great response to their medication with tremor, but some other people not so much. So don't panic if you have a tremor and it isn't being reduced a great deal by the medication. Medications are very good for treating the next two symptoms that we're going to talk about. The next acronym, the letter R, stands for rigidity or stiffness. There is increased resistance to passive movement. There's a constant tension or contraction of the muscles. So generally speaking, if I reach out my arm, I have a set of muscles that is extending and another one that at the same time is contracting. That is often lost with Parkinson's disease. And if you think of some of the things that your doctor asks you to do during your examination when you go in to see them for your first exam and or for your follow-up checkups, you'll realize why they're looking at these things. And when they say, pull against my arm or, push and that sort of thing, that's what they're looking for, that increased tension. Also stiffness that's associated and also complaints of weakness. These typically do respond well to drug treatment. Akinesia is a handy word in as much that it fits into the acronym. A in the medical terminology means absence of. Kinesia is movement. So it's basically defined as absence of spontaneous movement. That means that if you want to get up out of your chair and walk out the door, that ability to be able to be spontaneous with your movement may no longer be possible for you. But a very common word that we often use is bradykinesia. Brady is slowness. Again, kinesia is movement. So that's basically the slowing down of spontaneous or automatic movement. It's a disabling and distressing symptom that typically also can respond very well to drug treatment. The P in TRAP stands for postural instability. Basically, people often become hunched over with their posture. This puts your center of gravity ahead of you, so then you have problems with impaired balance, loss of natural postural reflexes. If you think sometimes doctors will do a pull test on your examination, that's what they're looking for. If they pull back quickly and abruptly on your shoulders and you fall backwards, can you get your balance again quickly? Otherwise, you will fall. Also, when it comes to postural instability, loss of arm swing comes into here. And that, combined with your stooped posture, can certainly lead to instability and walking difficulties. I think this is the most disabling symptom. It's also a very difficult one to treat, but the good news is that it doesn't happen until Parkinson's is in very late or advanced stages. Some of the other motor symptoms that I think it's important to talk about, these are all in connection with TRAP. So all the things we're going to talk about and loss of these things we're going to talk about is as a result of the words TRAP. So they're all involved with either tremor, rigidity, akinesia or bradykinesia, and problems with posture. Okay? So again, loss of facial expression, reduced blinking, difficulty speaking. You may have a very soft voice where people feel like your mute button is on and they want to press a button to make your voice louder. Or you may sound like you have a mouthful of cotton wool. So something like, you know exactly what you're saying, but the person you're talking to may say, your voice is very muffled, or I can't understand what you're saying. And it's a very disabling symptom. People are always asking you either to speak up, sometimes this can be a problem between caregivers and people with Parkinson's because it becomes a domestic problem. The person with Parkinson's is trying very hard to speak up because the amount of energy and effort that they're using with their very soft voice makes them feel like they should be shouting. But in actual fact, their voice remains very soft in spite of their best efforts. And sometimes the person with Parkinson's will say to the caregiver, you need a hearing aid. I'm speaking quite loudly enough, thank you. Or the muffled voice is very problematic for people because having to repeat yourself again and again, it's usually not just repeat it once, but repeat yourself quite frequently, is a big difficulty. Problems with swallowing. This is because, again, some of the muscles that are involved with TRAP, with the motor symptoms, are things that we can't see. Swallowing is one of those sets of muscles that requires a whole lot of things working in perfect coordination in order for you to swallow successfully. Successful swallowing, all that means is that when you put food or liquid or even with your own saliva, that it's going down the right tube. You've got two tubes in your throat. One is the esophagus going to the stomach, the other is going into the airway. When people have problems with swallowing, what can happen is that there's a little cap that's supposed to fit over the airway that prevents food and liquid and saliva from going down into the lungs. If that little cap isn't moved properly by a muscle, because the muscle is very slow and very stiff, again, we go back to the whole TRAP business, then things can go, quote unquote, down the wrong way, and swallowing issues can be very problematic and often end up with something called aspiration pneumonia. So it's something that really needs to be paid attention to. Small handwriting, we call it micrographia. Small handwriting is often one of the first symptoms that people with Parkinson's notice. I've spoken to several people who they thought their handwriting looked a little off, suspicious, They thought it had deteriorated, but they really noticed it when they got to the bank and signed a check, and the teller said, "This is not your signature." So that can become a very major inconvenience, to say the least, for people with Parkinson's as well. Not swinging the arms is obviously something that when doctors during your examination will ask you to walk up and down the hall, then that's what they're looking for. Reduced arm swing on the same side that you would have a tremor, for example. Problems getting in and out of a chair, turning over in bed, your feet shuffling, small or very short steps, your feet sticking to the ground or freezing. We can talk about all of these in more detail later if you have any questions about these. I just wanted to go over the motor symptoms that we often are looking for, especially during your examination with the doctor, so he can tell how things are going. As far as the non-motor symptoms are concerned, I mentioned in the first slide that the focus of the motor symptoms that we have just reviewed was dramatically sharpened in the 1960s with the discovery that they were due to a loss of dopamine-producing cells. Those are nerve cells in the brain that are supposed to produce dopamine, and that they could be improved by giving people levodopa. So two really important things happened. Discovery of why people were behaving the way they were in terms of what was causing the symptoms, and the fact that the symptoms could be improved by giving people levodopa, Sinemet, or Prolopa, whichever one you happen to be taking. So now researchers and clinicians knew what was causing the symptoms, and they had a way of treating them. End of story? Absolutely not. As early as the 1960s, at the beginning of this breakthrough, doctors knew that while they were examining their patients' motor symptoms, people were showing up in their offices with other very diverse complaints and symptoms, like, "Doctor, I'm absolutely exhausted. I'm not just tired, I'm absolutely exhausted." We now call that fatigue. People were constipated. That meant that some people were only having a bowel movement once a week, maybe twice a week, but it was really a big problem. People were feeling extremely depressed without being able to pin it on anything. They just had lost interest in everything, didn't want to go out with people, didn't want to do things, lost interest in hobbies that they had been enjoying all their lives. They'd lost their sense of smell, and they realized that the clinicians and researchers suddenly began to realize that they had been defining Parkinson's much too narrowly. This meant that they had been restricting their research and investigations too much, and were looking at only one part of the brain, part of the brain that's responsible for movement, and at the expense of other crucial areas of investigation. So it's now recognized as a multifaceted and complex disorder, a fact that none of you listening this evening needs to be told. So other areas of the brain and the body need to be examined if we're ever going to be able to answer the question, what exactly is Parkinson's? It also explains why your levodopa, Sinemet, or Prolopa doesn't improve these non-motor symptoms. Why it is so important for you to know what the non-motor symptoms are so that you can talk to your doctor and get appropriate treatment for them. It's also becoming apparent that many of the non-motor symptoms actually predate the motor symptoms, and therefore it's increasingly likely that Parkinson's disease doesn't begin in the part of the brain that controls movement, as has been thought for so many years. The jury is still out as to where it actually does start. Some thoughts are the olfactory bulb. This is located in the lower part of the brainstem. So your brainstem basically starts at the bottom of at the top of your spine and goes right down your spine. And that's where the olfactory bulb is. And that, of course, controls our ability to smell. Recent research has shown that 100% of people with Parkinson's actually have problems with smell. It's a matter of severity. Some people can smell, they haven't lost their complete sense of smell, so they can smell, but to a lesser degree than they were before. Some people have completely lost their sense of smell. They're also looking at things like the lower bowel. That's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We're going to get to that in a few minutes as well. But that's related to why people are so constipated. Also, what we call rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder is also thought to be part and parcel of Parkinson's, located again in the brainstem. And as many as 50 to 60% of people with Parkinson's are actually diagnosed with this. Many have symptoms of this years before the motor symptoms. So we're going to look at some of these non-motor symptoms now. It's an exciting time for Parkinson's research because now so many areas of the brain are being studied and investigated. These all give us clues to the puzzle. What is Parkinson's? So the non-motor symptoms, we're going to start with poor short-term memory. This is a very, very big problem for many people with Parkinson's. And they automatically think, when they think of memory, they think loss of memory equals Alzheimer's disease. That is not the case. Do not think that just because you have some issues with short-term memory, that all your memories are gone and that you automatically have Alzheimer's. Memories are deposited in the memory bank. That's how I look at it anyway. People with Parkinson's have trouble making withdrawals, so they go into their memory bank, and sometimes the teller's not there, so they can't make a withdrawal of the memory that they're trying to remember. But if they have some cueing or some hints, or if the teller shows up again, sure enough, they can remember, and they remember accurately. So they may not be able to remember something right away. They may need some hints, but the difference between Parkinson's memory issues and Alzheimer's, for example, is that somebody with Alzheimer's would not respond to cueing. People with Parkinson's also have difficulty with their inability to plan and organize and prioritize. So, for example, if you are a person who likes to give dinner parties, you know that dinner parties involve a whole lot of planning and organizing. First of all, you have to prioritize. I don't suggest, for example, that you send out your invitations before you know the date of the event and the venue for the event. So you need to tell people on the invitation where to show up to. But those issues around planning, sending out invitations, making sure that you have the venue secured, etc., knowing what you're going to have for the meal even. Those things all require a lot of planning and organizing. And that can become very difficult for people with Parkinson's. Problems with concentration and paying attention is also a big problem. People with Parkinson's are easily distracted. Memory problems are often associated with attention problems. So the two things can go together. Because if someone's attention isn't focused, he or she isn't going to be able to remember instructions that were given. So it's really important to understand that these things are all linked together. Remember the term that we used back with the motor symptoms called bradykinesia? Well, brady again means slow. But when we're talking about problems with cognitive changes, we talk about bradyphrenia. Phrenia is the ability to think. So we have slowness of thinking. Slow thinking, just like bradykinesia, means slow movement. People with Parkinson's need extra time to answer questions or make decisions. So they can usually think things out. It just takes more time. Another of the changes, the non-motor changes that we often are confronted with, are the emotional changes. Anxiety can be a huge problem for people with Parkinson's, as is depression. Some people experience loss of impulse control. Now, a few years ago, loss of impulse control was related to one of the dopamine agonist medications, commonly known as Mirapex. Um, Most of the dopamine agonists can produce impulse control. That just seems to be one of the biggest problems with that particular medication. But again, if you're gambling or shopping or eating, or if your sexual libido is out of control, for example, those can be very, very big problems in relationships in particular. Then there can be things like increased emotions. I've had lots of people say that they cry at movies, or they cry when a story that isn't particularly sad is being related. They burst into tears. I even had somebody not too long ago say that if there's a cute, warm, and fuzzy commercial on television, they cry. For those of you who may have seen a commercial, it's about Salty and Pepper, and it's about Salt who loses Pepper, and Salty is really sad, and because he can't find Pepper. And I had one gentleman say the other day that he even cries when Salty and Pepper come on, and he just has to completely turn off the commercial because he can't stand it. He's just in floods of tears. Or sometimes it's fuzzy little puppies. There used to be, I think it was a commercial for Cottonelle, where somebody was unrolling a roll of toilet paper, and a little puppy was chasing it on a very slippery floor, and suddenly the puppy went into the wall, and it was like boom splat. And this gentleman was bursting into tears, thinking the poor puppy. Anyway, I'm just sharing. Okay, so it can be something like increased emotions like that are not in proportion to the event that's actually happening. Or a joke can be told, and yes, it's funny, but the person with Parkinson's may have control even controlling their laughter. It's just out of control. Then there can be decreased emotions, which can be a very big problem. We call it apathy, and apathy just basically means loss of interest in anything and everything. I've had care partners say to me, if my husband or my wife doesn't get off the Chesterfield and just sit there and do nothing, it's driving me crazy. Well, it drives people with Parkinson's crazy as well, because to lose your interest and to lose your ability to want to do things and go places, these are all things that are very difficult to deal with. But apathy is tough to treat. But the other things that we've talked about, the anxiety, the depression, loss of impulse control, those things are all really treatable. So again, it's important to connect the dots and make sure you understand these are all part of your non-motor symptoms. Then we get to the autonomic nervous system changes. I call them the automatic nervous system changes, because these are things that we can take for granted usually. Those of us without Parkinson's don't have to be worried about these things because they still happen automatically for us. So for example, one good example is swallowing and drooling. So as I've been sitting here talking more at you than with you tonight because I can't see you, I've been swallowing, I presume, appropriately, because I don't seem to be drooling. I don't know, maybe John can check that out. But okay, so there you go. So apparently I don't have a swallowing issue. But the bottom line is with drooling. So my swallowing reflexes are intact. They are automatic as my mouth recognizes that I've produced saliva and it's time to swallow. It just happens automatically. But drooling can be a huge and very embarrassing problem for people with Parkinson's because your automatic swallowing reflex is on the fritz. And therefore, you might need some cueing, and we can talk about it if anybody has any more questions about it at the end of the presentation. So, talking about the autonomic nervous system, I talked a lot about, when I gave the little introduction, about the problems with constipation. huge problems for people with Parkinson's related to constipation because your bowel is all comprised of muscle. And again, not muscles you can see, but for those of us without Parkinson's, they're muscles that you can take for granted. But again, with Parkinson's, you can't. So sometimes you need to do things as far as taking in more water, increasing fiber, even getting down to using a laxative, whatever you need to do. But emptying your bowel is very important. And certainly when it comes to constipation, not only is it uncomfortable and causes those of us without Parkinson's to have stomach aches or what feels like a stomach ache or to be bloated, actually constipation is a huge problem for people with Parkinson's because that's where your medication goes to be absorbed. So you put a pill in your mouth, goes down the esophagus, hopefully, because you don't have a swallowing issue, goes to the stomach to begin to be broken down by the acids and enzymes that are in your stomach. But the next place it goes is into your small intestine. And if you're constipated, that's where your medication will stay because it doesn't get out of there, and the bowel gladly uses it up, says thank you very much, because the brain isn't the only organ that uses dopamine. So the body says thank you very much. I could use a little more dopamine in this area, and then it never gets out into your circulation, and therefore it never even gets to the brain. Not a good thing. So constipation has consequences that are more than just the uncomfortable bloaty feeling that a lot of us experience. Urinary dysfunction can be varied. People have frequency, they have many different problems. They feel like when they get the urge to go, it's like, oops, too late. Or they may feel like they have to get up and use the washroom several times in the night when in actual fact the bladder is empty. The bladder, again, is a muscle. It's controlled by the autonomic or automatic nervous system, and therefore sometimes it's not getting the messages properly either, and therefore it's very disruptive to sleep and all kinds of different problems. Diarrhea, just like constipation, so the losing of stool can also happen because the sphincter and muscles that are supposed to control the stool and allow you to get to the washroom on time, they're not getting messages properly either. They can be too loose, and therefore the stool can just literally seep out. Excessive sweating. Lots of people with Parkinson's, even it can be an absolutely freezing cold day. Doesn't matter about the environment, it doesn't matter about the room temperature, it doesn't matter about anything. They just have excessive bouts of sweating. Again, your thermostat is controlled by your automatic nervous system. So if you find yourself breaking out into huge amounts of sweat, again, that's something that it's because your thermostat isn't working properly. Moving on to the psychiatric symptoms. So hallucinations are when you see things that other people can't see. And often with Parkinson's, these things that other people can't see are usually small things. So some people will see little children or little animals, and sometimes they're not a big problem. And sometimes doctors will choose, depending on the amount of distress that it's bringing to you and impacting on your life, some doctors choose not to treat the hallucinations, because if they're not a big problem, then leave them alone. Treatment involves either reducing your Sinemet or your Prolopa, because it will be the levodopa in most cases that is bringing these symptoms out, or so you can reduce that, which means, of course, that you're reducing your ability to be able to move. But the other problem with hallucinations as well is that if they get to be very, very scary, and you're hallucinating things like that your home is on fire and you need to try to escape from it, or that sort of thing. Somebody's after you with a knife, or really serious problems that are impacting your life, then you could go on an anti-psychotic medication. But again, every medication has its own symptoms and side effects, so it's really important to try to manage this. But bottom line, I didn't say this at the beginning, but regardless of what you are experiencing, it's really, really important that you talk about these things. They may be very distressing to you, and sometimes, in some cases, very embarrassing, but it's really important to talk about that. Some people with Parkinson's also have delusions. These are what we call fixed beliefs that are not based in reality. So some people think that that their husband or their wife is having an affair, or that their bank accounts are being compromised, that the husband or the wife or even the children are taking money from them. Those kinds of thoughts, which are very distressing and have a huge impact on relationships, can also be part and parcel of Parkinson's disease.
Sandy, you've been asked to project a little
Oh, I'm
louder
sorry.
if you can.
Gosh, usually I'm asked to not talk quite so loudly, so I apologize for that. Okay, sleep problems. We had an excellent speaker last week, and if you go to the Parkinson's website starting tomorrow, you'll be able to see on PDTV that there is a very good explanation of sleep issues for people with Parkinson's. So they can be anything from falling asleep during the day. We call that excessive daytime sleepiness. People can't fall asleep. They fall asleep and then they waken partway through the night, and as a result they're not getting their replenished restful sleep. There's also a big problem called rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder. I did refer to this a little earlier. This is where people have during their dream state. So those of us without Parkinson's, when we're dreaming, basically there are just two muscle groups in our bodies that stay awake and alert. The rest are almost in a paralyzed state. And the two muscle groups that stay awake for those of us without Parkinson's are our eyes and our diaphragms, which is just as well, because if our diaphragms were paralyzed during sleep, none of us would be having this conversation this evening. And again, it's our eyes. But for people with Parkinson's, all of your systems and organs stay on alert. So if you're having a bad dream, a nightmare, you think that somebody's in the bedroom and against you, or fighting with you, or you need to get up and run away from the room because something very bad is happening, etc. You might thrash out, you could hurt your care partner, you could hurt yourself. Rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder is very, very treatable. So you need to talk about it with your physician and ensure that you get the right medication to treat this disorder. Also, restless leg syndrome. This is a syndrome where people feel like they have worms or really uncomfortable feelings in their legs, and they just can't lie still. Often causes people to get up during the night because this is very troublesome. Again, it's a symptom that is very treatable, and if this is happening to you, you need to speak to your doctor about it. Other problems related to non-motor symptoms are change in taste and smell. We talked about loss of smell or loss of sense of smell. Sometimes taste is also affected. The choking and swallowing problems, we talked about that. Unexplained pain, unexplained weight loss, sexual dysfunction can really be a big problem for many people with Parkinson's. And we had an excellent talk recently from a sex therapist who came here from Israel talking about sexual dysfunction, and we have some of her information and notes that if this is an issue for you that you'd like to look into further, please give us a call and we'll help you with that.
I believe that presentation will also be available online shortly.
Okay.
We're just waiting to get it up.
Okay. So orthostatic hypotension, big fancy words, it just means that you get dizzy when you're standing up. And one way of determining whether you have this or not is when you go to your doctor's office the next time, get them to take your blood pressure when you're sitting, stand up and get them to take it again immediately, because there will be a significant drop in your blood pressure if you have this problem. It's very important to know about, because it's not a matter of just being dizzy when you're standing up. But if you try to move when you're feeling this way, you will fall. And of course, consequences of falls are humongous. Problems with breaking, any limb, breaking your pelvis, all kinds of issues can occur. So it's important again to deal with this big blood pressure problem. Problems with leg swelling can also be often related to your anti-Parkinson's medications, and obviously are a big problem. But again, it's important to remember that leg swelling, for example, could also be a sign or a symptom of a heart problem. So it's important to get it checked out and figure out what's causing the swelling. Double vision can happen with Parkinson's because your eyes are moved by muscles. And if the muscles are not what I call yoking or traveling together in a systematic way, if one eye muscle, say for example, if the eye muscle behind your right eye, if that's where your Parkinson's is the worst, is not tracking at the same time as the eye muscle in the left, you will have double vision, because vision requires you to move, your eyes to move together. And fatigue, of course, we've talked about that, but again, that can be a symptom of other issues as well as Parkinson's. But many people with Parkinson's feel that fatigue is one of their most disabling symptoms. So in conclusion, really none of the dimensions and symptoms of Parkinson's that we've talked about tonight, to date, are news to the scientists and researchers and or clinicians. But now they are really being recognized and addressed, in particular, the non-motor symptoms. We have a new non-motor guide to symptoms of Parkinson's disease. We've had a lot of really excellent feedback about this. And if you would like a copy, you can receive one. We're hoping to get more copies from the publisher soon, but we also have copies that we can send out to people, because the quality of the lives of people with Parkinson's will greatly improve if your ability to be able to recognize and talk to your doctor about some of these very troubling symptoms occur, and you're able to speak to them so that your doctor will understand. So that's really what I wanted to share with you tonight, and I would be more than open to any questions. As I said at the beginning, I hope this wasn't just a same old presentation. If it was, I apologize for that, but any questions would be greatly appreciated.
So, I promised Sandy 30 minutes. She gave us 45, and we're very appreciative of that, I'm sure, but we do have a few moments left for questions. So if you have any to ask, and thank you, Robin, for submitting yours now, you can ask them in the chat pod, or if you're particularly ambitious, there is a button towards the top of the screen here, just above my arrow, that looks like a little person raising their hand, and if you click that, you can raise your hand, and if you have a microphone attached to your computer, we'll be able to hear you speak. For anyone that has challenges typing or just would prefer to speak their question. Otherwise, please ask them in the chat pod. And Sandy, Robin has asked us, can these symptoms be transient? I get most of them, but not every day.
Absolutely. These symptoms can come and go. This is very common, particularly at the beginning of the signs of the motor symptoms showing up, and even some of the non-motor symptoms. They do come and go, and they can come and go. They can come for a day and disappear for a month or even 2 months, and then you'll notice, like for example, a tremor. You may have noticed that you had a tremor in your little finger, and then the tremor will go away, and you'll think, oh, well, I guess it was just pressing on a nerve or something of that nature, and then it goes away again. So definitely more toward the beginning of the condition, symptoms are transient, but it can really happen at any time or regardless of how long you've had Parkinson's. It's one of the reasons that Parkinson's is really tough to treat because, for example, if you're in very early stage of Parkinson's and the day that you go for your diagnostic examination, whatever symptom it is that took you to the doctor in the first place isn't there, sometimes the doctor has to say, we just have to wait and see. And basically, we just have to wait for more symptoms to show up before we can actually diagnose this as being Parkinson's, because it doesn't show up in any blood work, and it certainly doesn't show up on any kind of imaging. So basically, the doctors have to rely on their education into Parkinson's disease as well as their experience, which is why we suggest to people that they go to a movement disorder specialist. And these are the doctors, the neurologists that have the most experience and education into Parkinson's, etc. And therefore, that's why we recommend that. But even they sometimes have to say, this, we can't define this at the moment. We have to wait for other things to happen or for the symptoms to become more consistent, which is really, really difficult, I think, for people with Parkinson's, because you have to wait a long time for your appointment with the specialist, and then you get told, well, it may be or it may not be, we're not sure, and that sort of thing. So I hope that has answered your question, Robin, in terms of the transience of the symptoms. I've talked to lots of people with Parkinson's who have symptoms and then they disappear, and the days that they disappear, they really convince themselves, well, I don't have Parkinson's. Even after the diagnosis is made, this can happen, because you can get up in the morning and just feel perfectly fine if your medication is working, if your naturally produced dopamine is producing lots of dopamine that particular day. You're able to move and do anything that you want to do whenever you want to do it. So as a result, it can be really very helpful to understand that yes, they can certainly come and go.
Sandy, I want to add something to that, and also I'll point out, in case you're not seeing it, that Robin noticed that she's not yet diagnosed, but has been experiencing these things.
Yeah.
And while, of course, we're certainly not going to make a diagnosis over the computer,
No.
That's what a lot of people find, is that some of these symptoms do precede an official diagnosis.
Absolutely.
And those are the things that lead them to getting checked. As Sandy was speaking about the individual and transient nature of the symptoms, it also occurred to me that one thing that we recommend to people is tracking those things, because they do come and go. And Sandy has a sheet in front of her now that we call a Parkinson's summary, and I've provided a link here in the chat for you. That's to download this form on our website, and it's something that we're giving to people to help them track their symptoms so that they can report them to their neurologist when they go to visit them. It doesn't allow as much detail as it can, but also we suggest people journaling their symptoms, and perhaps you'll notice a trend there as well, that the certain symptoms are worse in the evening or vice versa, and those are things that will help when discussing them with your doctor and coming up with a treatment plan, whether you're someone who is yet to be diagnosed or someone who has been living with Parkinson's for, say, 20 years. I see. That's great, Robin. I'm glad you found it to be helpful. And If you have any further questions, Sandy's email is here on the screen, and we're full of hopefully good resources like that, and I know that her head is full of them as well. I think I see that Marg is typing a note here, but if anyone else has further questions, please feel free to come ahead with them, come forward with them.
Okay.
Okay, so for those that aren't reading the chat, Marg has asked a question, and it's discussing her off times. And for those that don't experience them, when we refer to on and off, I mean essentially that's times when things are functioning well. It's an on time when your medications are working or your symptoms aren't really present. You're able to accomplish all the things that you want to. Off times, again, typically related to the function of your medication. Symptoms are returning. Sometimes this is a common time of day. Other times they just come and go with little warning. Is that a good synopsis of on versus off?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So recently, Marg's off times have disappeared, but after a 2-week period, they seem to have come back, and they're actually worse or more off than they were prior to that when they've been experienced. Any thoughts on that?
Right. That's a tough one. I'm sure you've heard that more than enough, Mark, to be able to say exactly, of course, what's going on. We can't. What I find is that sometimes when off times go away, it's also often in conjunction with something else that might be going on with your life. For example, if you were having a great many offs and then you say started, for example, a really stringent exercise program, we talk about hope, we talk about the placebo effect, we talk about mind over matter. And I think sometimes that we hope so much and we really want so badly that this will be the answer for this particular problem that we can actually almost, quote unquote, talk ourselves into, and sometimes even just more dopamine gets produced at those times when you're doing something that you hope will be a treatment that will really, really help. I don't know if that gives you any idea about that or any benefit, if that's helped at all. But as I said, I've known people who, for example, even if they were expecting a visit or from a family member or from anybody, somebody they hadn't seen in a long time, suddenly they're able to sort of get up and go and do all the things that they need to be able to do, and then after the visit, back comes the symptoms again.
Mark's also pointed out that with those off times, there seemed to be more pain associated with them than usual.
Yeah. So off, as John has described, basically means that your medications aren't working. And we know that pain in Parkinson's is usually experienced with the off times because that's when the muscles are particularly rigid and tense. And when muscles are rigid, that's when you're going to have pain. So that makes perfect sense. Pain in Parkinson's, as I said, is usually associated with the muscle rigidity and the tension, as I talked about earlier, that you know, it's when one muscle contracts, another extends, and muscles usually what I call play nicely together. And the bottom line is that um, that doesn't happen. If that doesn't happen, and muscles are just tense, etc., then that can really be very painful. So, yeah, I see your next note, and that's really helpful, Mark, to know that the disappearance of the times when it was with an up period, which kind of fits in a little bit with, or at least a lot really, with what I was trying to explain about how your optimism can become a placebo, and therefore, you think this is the answer, this is it, this is going to help, and then when you figure out that yes, it may help in the long run, but it's not lasting, and it's just called, unfortunately, progression with Parkinson's.
I see a thank you note from Fred and Paiza, and thank you guys for coming. And thanks to everyone as well for joining us. We'll stay here, I think, pretty much as long as we have questions. But for those of you that are choosing to drop off, again, Sandy's contact info is there. Maybe there are questions better asked offline, or whatever the case may be. So we thank you, and again, we'll hang around as long as there's discussion. Sandy, you've got a note from Robin there. I guess regarding trauma, things of that nature.
Yeah. So Robin is asking that she didn't seem to have any symptoms prior to a car accident, and she's wondering if that could be a trigger. And also, she's asking about could it be related to multiple blood transfusions. Bottom line is, of course, we don't know what causes Parkinson's, and we can't extrapolate and say that a very serious thing like a car accident causes Parkinson's any more than we can extrapolate, because, for example, we get questions, for example, about Muhammad Ali, and is the fact that, he was a boxer and had his brain pummeled within his skull every day, all day for years, did that cause his Parkinson's? These traumas do not cause Parkinson's. But what research has shown us is that if Parkinson's was there and was rather latent, that what these serious things can do is that they act almost like a catalyst, and they can bring Parkinson's symptoms to the fore that may have either remained latent always or may have remained latent until later in the individual's life. So did your car accident cause your Parkinson's? The answer is no. Your Parkinson's was already there, shall I say, because the symptoms we know are a combination of things that it's just your genetic makeup, not that it's passed from generation to generation, but it's the way you're put together in combination with something to do with the environment. And that can be one of many things that are being researched as we speak. But so the bottom line is your Parkinson's was there, and sometimes a serious trauma, like a motor vehicle accident, can then bring those symptoms to the fore. I hope that explains that. I don't believe that your Parkinson's was brought out by multiple blood transfusions. I don't see any correlation there, but I could look into that for you, and if I come up with anything, I could certainly let you know if I had your email address.
I have Robin's email,
okay,
Sandy,
so
if you do find something, we'll follow up.
If I do find something, because believe me, I don't have all the answers. If these brilliant researchers in the world don't have all the answers, Sandy Jones doesn't have them either. But if I don't know something, I don't know it. Um, so there you go. I don't make it up as I go along. I'll find out the answer.
I just learned something from you regarding the role of trauma, and not as a cause per se, but as something that brings out perhaps existing predispositions.
Absolutely.
I've seen it been said those words, but the way you shared that was valuable for me. Robin's last question. You're entitled to more if you do have them, but she's asking about lifespan or prognosis, I guess.
Yeah. So this is a question that we get a lot. And Robin, when I first started here about 14 years ago, I quite comfortably said to everybody, oh no, Parkinson's will not shorten your lifespan at all. Period, the end of story. What I've learned about Parkinson's now is that while it doesn't shorten your lifespan, in other words, in terms of, we're all going to die at some point, obviously, but let's just say that an average individual may pass away now. People seem to be getting older and older, but let's just say in their 90s, for example. Will Parkinson's shorten that life? And maybe by a couple of years. And the reason I say that it's very minimal, so I don't think it's something that you need to be quote unquote worried about. But we do know that some of the complications of the later stages of Parkinson's, so your propensity, for example, to have a fall, or possibly problems if you develop problems with swallowing, those things can shorten one life's span. Because if you develop aspiration pneumonia and then you couple that with just being older, and you'll have other medical conditions probably by that time on top of the Parkinson's. Parkinson's unfortunately doesn't protect you from developing other things. So I would say the answer to your question is possibly yes, not necessarily, but if it does, it won't be by like 10 years or anything of that nature. It may shorten your life by a couple of years. So that's as honest as I can be.
The other reality is, of course, also that the progression of Parkinson's itself, which is another question we get, how long do I have before I face X problem or something of that nature, is very different for everyone. There are things that you can do to delay it. We can cover those perhaps in another session, but things like exercise, paying attention to your well-being generally, things of that nature will help delay the progression of Parkinson's, and everyone is going to progress differently. I believe that covers everything.
Okay. Okay, so we've had a question here that an individual has, the two biggest issues she has are falls and aspiration pneumonia. Because this won't be a problem for everybody, I won't go into detail about this, but I would suggest maybe that the best idea for you would be to give me a call. You can see my number up on the screen, or write me an email, and let's have a talk about that, because those symptoms in general, and regardless of who's writing them, are real complications that I think absolutely need to be paid attention to, and the sooner the better. So I think that would probably be the next best step with that question. And then we have another comment. Nora Lee says it's encouraging to remember that not everybody will get every symptom. thank you for re-emphasizing that. I apologize if I didn't emphasize that enough during the presentation. I'm really glad that you brought that out again, Nora Lee, because that is really important. You know, one of our issues here when we're talking to people, especially for those people who Parkinson's may be a new diagnosis for them, it's, you know, how much information should we give people? And if we don't give enough, then you get blindsided. If we give you too much, then you can say, whoa, information overload here. But it's absolutely true that not everybody will get every symptom. So it's a matter of being, I call it like having a toolkit. So you have your tools in your toolkit, i.e., you have your information. It's just, for example, like your car. In your car, you have your spare tire, you have your jack, you know, whatever. I mean, you may have other things if you're really handy with the car, that sort of thing. But so that if you get a flat tire, you have a way, you have a tool to use that, you know, you can problem solve around that particular problem. It's the same with your Parkinson's toolkit. If you have a toolkit full of information about what may or may not happen and coping strategies and ways around those things, then you can absolutely take those tools out if and when you need them. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, and that's a good thing. That particular tool can just stay in the toolkit and you never need to address it. But that's really important, Norley. Thanks very much for ensuring that that I spoke that again, because I probably didn't emphasize that enough.
And with that, I think it's a perfect note to end on. So for those of you who are left, thanks a lot for coming. I hope you found it valuable. Sandy, thank you for your time. And keep your eyes open because we'll be doing something like this again. Thanks, everybody.